Graham Hancock's lost civilization theory has captivated millions. The idea that an advanced, forgotten culture once spread knowledge across the ancient world, only to vanish in a global cataclysm. But to understand why so many people believe this, we have to look deeper, not just at the theory, but at the mindset that makes it so appealing. First, it begins with how we read ancient stories. Instead of seeing religious and mythological texts as rich metaphors, as ancient poetry that spoke of inner journeys and human struggles, many have been taught to take them literally. The flood story wasn't a symbol of renewal, it was a historical global event. The tales of golden ages weren't reflections of the human longing for harmony, they were evidence of lost high technology. And once we mistake metaphor for history, we start searching for evidence that was never meant to exist. Second, there's the way we see science. Many think science is about trust, as if it's a belief system, like religion. But science isn't about trust. Science is about understanding. It's a method, a careful, humble, and often complex process of testing, questioning, and refining what we know. And because real science is complex, because it takes work to grasp geology, archaeology, astronomy, simple stories like Hancock's feel easier, clearer, and more satisfying. They offer a grand pattern without the hard work of learning how we really know what we know. And here's where the real trap closes. People who embrace these simple alternative theories often believe they're seeing truths the experts miss, that they're smarter than the so-called elites who actually understand the science and history. But the sad reality is the opposite. The theories feel deep, but they're shallow. And those who cling to them are often much less informed than they believe. If we want to break free of this trap, we have to do two things. Stop mistaking myths for literal history, and start engaging with science, not as something to trust or distrust, but as something to understand. When we do that, we see that the real history of humanity, the true story of how we rose from small bands of hunter-gatherers to builders of cities and monuments, is more astonishing than any lost civilization fantasy. And this is where people like Graham Hancock, Billy Carson, and Randall Carlson find their audience. An audience that's been set up by these misunderstandings. Because when people don't really know how science works, it's easy to sell them a story. All these pseudoscientists have to do is say the wrong thing, and it sounds right. If a monument shows signs of wind erosion, they'll call it water erosion, and people won't know the difference. If it is water erosion, they'll say, see, this proves a global flood or some cataclysmic event. The details don't matter. What matters is that it sounds dramatic, and that it fits the story they want to tell. If the dimensions of a monument happen, by coincidence, to line up with some astronomical phenomenon, something that happens all the time in math when you work with enough numbers, they'll say the ancient builders must have intended it, that they had secret knowledge of stars and cycles they couldn't possibly have known. They never consider that coincidence is common in large data sets, or that our brains are wired to spot patterns even when none were planned. If geology shows a natural process at work, the slow shaping of rock by wind, water, or ice, they'll say, no, this was done by ancient technology. This was artificial. Again, because it sounds impressive, and because most people don't know what natural geological features actually look like over deep time. And there's another trick they use, over and over, pitching everything at face value. They'll say, look at this. It looks like machinery. It looks like a giant sculpture. It looks artificial. But real science knows that we can't just trust what something looks like. That's why we build tools, telescopes, microscopes, that radiocarbon dating equipment, satellite imaging, to go beyond our senses, because our senses are limited, because reality is more complex than what we see on the surface. That's the difference between science and pseudoscience. Science digs deeper, asks harder questions, uses data, methods, and tools to test ideas. Pseudoscience stays at the surface, because the surface is where it can sell you a story, and that story always feels easier, clearer, and more exciting than the real, complicated, astonishing history of how our world was really shaped. But if we're brave enough to let go of the easy answers, if we're willing to do the work of learning how science actually works, what we find is more wondrous than any lost civilization fantasy. We find the true story of the Earth, of humanity, of the universe itself, a story written not in conspiracies, but in evidence. One of the most dangerous traps of pseudoscience is that it teaches people to believe they've done the work of real research, when they haven't. The audiences drawn to these ideas don't dive into scientific papers. They don't study geology, archaeology, astronomy, or history in depth. What they do is listen to people who claim to have done research. They watch videos that follow the same pattern. A picture is shown, a little story is told about it, another picture, another little story, and another, each one chosen to fit a single narrative, each one with just enough detail to sound convincing without ever inviting real questioning or deeper study. And after enough of these images and stories are strung together, the audience walks away believing they've done real research. They feel like they've uncovered hidden truths. And here's the irony. They start to believe that the real experts, the archaeologists, the geologists, the astronomers, don't do any research at all. That these experts are just pushing one grand, rigged narrative designed to fool the world. But at the same time, those same experts and their work have given us everything we rely on. The science that powers our technology, the medicine that keeps us alive, the tools that make modern life possible. The very world that makes it possible for people to spread these conspiracy theories depends on the science they claim is all fake. And this confusion leads to one of the strangest reversals of all. These audiences think they're being smart, skeptical, and independent-minded by rejecting the real, evidence-based history of humanity. They believe that history, the true, complex story built from data, discovery, and hard-won knowledge, is the fictional story made up by a few to control the many. And they believe that the actual fictional story, the one invented by a few pseudoscientists with no real evidence, is the true history. They point to real lost civilizations and imagine a global one that left no trace. They forget that the lost civilizations we do know about, the Maya, the Minoans, the Indus Valley, each fell to different local disasters at different times. There was no single global cataclysm that wiped out a worldwide advanced culture. That's fantasy. But it's a fantasy that feels simpler, cleaner, and more exciting than the true story of human history. And that's what pseudoscience sells. Not truth, but the illusion of having found the truth. A story that feels empowering because it tells people they're smarter than the experts, when in reality, it keeps them trapped in misunderstanding. Another reason pseudoscientific theories thrive, like Graham Hancock's lost civilization fantasy or ancient apocalypse conspiracies, is because science itself is often misrepresented in the media. Science gets portrayed as if it's just another kind of story, just another opinion in a debate. The real work of science, the methods, the data, the uncertainty, the constant testing and refining, gets flattened into sound bites, dramatic headlines, or clickbait claims. So when people see that, they get the wrong idea. They think science is about making bold statements and being right every time, instead of seeing science as what it really is, a process of learning, correcting, improving, and understanding the world with as much precision as we can. And then there's another fuel for the fire, the fact that a very small number of actual conspiracies in history have turned out to be true. Maybe a government covered something up. Maybe a corporation hid the dangers of its product. When these rare, real conspiracies come to light, they give people the sense that any conspiracy theory could be true. That because a few were exposed, they're all equally plausible. But that's simply not how evidence works. Just because a claim hasn't been proven doesn't mean it's on equal footing with every other idea. And just because we don't know something yet, or can't fully prove it today, that doesn't mean it can't ever be known, or that no one can prove it. Science is always working to fill those gaps, to test the unknown, to turn questions into knowledge. That's what science does. That's what sets it apart from pseudoscience, the willingness to do the hard work, not just tell easy stories. But conspiracy theories feed off that gap between what we know and what we don't. They turn "we don't know yet" into "you can believe anything you want." And that's how people get trapped, in a world where fiction feels like fact and real knowledge gets dismissed as part of the cover-up.